Beijing's neutrality prevails after talks with France and the EU in China. If their goal was to change Beijing's position on Ukraine, French President Emmanuel Macron and EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen went home empty-handed. But not all was a loss. We'll ask who came out ahead in business and diplomacy after France and the EU's three-day tour. I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is Macron and von der Leyen's visit to China. French President Emmanuel Macron started his three-day visit to China, in part hoping to push his Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping not to side with Moscow over the war in Ukraine. The goal was the same for EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, but where it went from there is what analysts are now debating. France eventually walked away with 36 signed business deals, which some say undermined the EU's collective economic leverage. And Beijing sought to undermine the US and its stance on Taiwan. Perhaps Beijing claimed a small victory there after Macron said Europe should not follow US or Chinese policy over Taiwan. Here's a look now at that visit.
As he touched down in China, French President Emmanuel Macron received a warm welcome from President Xi Jinping. On the last day of the trip, two counterparts came together at a tea ceremony. And while the scenes were pleasant, the issues on the table were not so. Macron and European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen had hoped to convince Beijing to pressure Russia into negotiations for a breakthrough in the Ukraine war.
The Russian aggression in Ukraine has dealt a blow to this stability and put an end to decades of peace in Europe. And I know that I can count on you, under the two principles I have just mentioned, to bring Russia to reason and everyone to the negotiating table. And we will come back to this in detail, but we need to find a lasting peace. That is to say, a peace that respects internationally recognized borders and avoids any form of escalation. And I believe that is an also important issue for China, as much as it is for France and for Europe.
Beijing has claimed neutrality since the conflict began and has tried to play the peacemaker. On the first anniversary of the Russian attack, it also announced a 12-point peace plan. The proposal urges the end of Western sanctions, the establishment of humanitarian corridors, as well as respect for the territorial integrity of all nations. Yet, Xi has not spoken directly with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in the past year, while cementing a no-limit partnership with Russia in his trip to Moscow last month. Kremlin said it would closely monitor the talks between Xi and the EU leaders and remain confident that China won't change its stance. And it didn't. Xi simply echoed the established Chinese position.
China advocates for peace talks and seeks a political solution. China is willing to join the French side in calling on the international community to maintain a rational restraint and avoid taking actions that will further aggravate the crisis or even get out of control. We urge all parties to fulfill the solemn promise that nuclear weapons will not be used and nuclear war will not be fought. Oppose the use of biological and chemical weapons under any circumstances.
Some have dubbed the joint trip by Macron and von der Leyen a good cop, bad cop strategy. While Paris considers China as a possible game changer in the conflict, von der Leyen is more skeptical as a strong ally of Washington. Days before the visit, she also harshly criticized China's stance on Ukraine as well as its human rights issues and trade practices. And in Beijing, she warned any arms supplies to Russia would seriously harm relations with the EU.
Indeed, as I reported, raised the point of arms deliveries. And I want to be very clear on that one, that arming the aggressor is a clear violation of international law. It's the aggressor, and he should never be armed.
These comments before the cameras were what many had expected. But the biggest surprise of the visit came during Macron's interview with journalists on the French Air Force One. As Politico reported, Macron said Europe must reduce its reliance on the US for weapons, energy, and the dollar. He said, "The great risk Europe faces is getting caught up in the crises that are not ours," in reference to Taiwan. After President Tsai Ing-wen met with US House Speaker Kevin McCarthy in California, China began a blockade and striking drills around the island. As tensions rise between the two world powers, Macron wants Europe to be a third superpower with strategic autonomy. He also told reporters that the worst thing would be to think that we Europeans must become followers on this topic and take our cue from the US agenda and a Chinese overreaction. It's now feared that Macron's comment could now fracture the united Western support of Ukraine and its response to the Russian aggression.
So, has the French EU visit demonstrated a united European front or simply emboldened China's unwavering stance on Russia, Ukraine, and Taiwan? Joining me now to debate the outcome of that three-day visit are, from Washington, John Herbst, Senior Director at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center and retired U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine and Uzbekistan. From Paris, Anne-Elisabeth Moutet, French columnist for the Daily Telegraph. And from Hong Kong, Andrew Leung, international and independent China strategist. Thanks all so much for being with us. John, I'll start with you. Given what the general public thought the aims of this visit were, in effect easing China away from Russia, if that were possible, do you think anything was achieved here?
Nothing whatsoever on that score. On the one hand, Xi did restate his long-standing policy regarding there should be no games with nuclear weapons, which is a rebuke to Putin's regular nuclear saber rattling. On the other hand, he in no way suggested he's going to use his influence to move Russia towards ending its aggression against Ukraine and support Ukraine's claims on its own territory.
So who do you think gained the most from this trip and these talks?
Well, I would say she gained a little bit because it looked like the president of France was kowtowing to China, perhaps in order to gain some business for his companies. Of course, he was accompanied by a large delegation of French business leaders.
Right.
But I would not put too much, give Xi or China too much credit, because the clumsy games that he played with Van Leyen to demonstrate that he could treat one European nicely and another European rudely, I think cuts against his aims to show China, in fact, is not backing Russia in its war in Ukraine.
Andrew, let me get your thoughts on what you heard there. And I need to point out, this was Ursula von der Leyen's first official trip to China. And it didn't go unnoticed that she wasn't met with the same red carpet treatment that Macron experienced. Why is that?
Well, it's because the Ursula von der Leyen has been consistently hyping up the rhetoric that China is regarded as an aggressor country and supported Russia, and then also human rights transgressions and all that. Whereas Macron is adopting a more nuanced approach. On the one hand, paying attention to perceived security concerns in France and in the European Union, but also wanting to maintain a constructive relationship with China. After all, China is the world's largest trading nation and is investing in a lot of infrastructure facilities connecting the Europe with Asia. And then, of course, at the end of the day, quite a number of European countries are getting a little bit tired with this war going on. No one supports the war. China doesn't support the war because China, of course, upholds the principle of the United Nations Charter, vis-a-vis Taiwan and all that. But on the other hand, China and Russia are pushed together, on one hand, by the United States, making the two countries their arch enemies.
Okay.
Secondly, China and Russia have been closely intertwined well before the war, because Russia is the world's largest exporter of energy and agricultural products, and China is the world's biggest customer. So the two economies have been intertwined well before the war.
Anne-Elisabeth, okay, let me ask you then, if you think China was perhaps able to exploit seeming divides between French and EU leadership specifically. John pointed out very well that, Macron showed up with a huge delegation of business leaders from France, unlike his EU counterpart.
I think what is probably even more dramatic in this is that Ursula von der Leyen was specifically invited to come by Emmanuel Macron, who was making a state visit to China, so very important visit, and that she was consistently treated badly. She was not greeted by anyone at the airport. She had to use the sort of corridor into the airport like every other passenger. She was abused on Chinese social media. There were articles against her about that statement that has just been referred to. It's very obvious that the choreography of a state visit is very difficult to change, but it's not been seen at any moment that Emmanuel Macron, who mooted the idea of getting her to come at the same time, lifted a finger to help her. So yes, has been noted in the EU. It's well played, China, but it's something that people will remember.
It's interesting, Anne-Elisabeth, because as we said, France came away with some 36 signed business deals. And Noah Barkin, an analyst from Rhodium Group that was speaking to the Financial Times, I just have to quote something he said because it's interesting. He specifically said that Macron missed an opportunity to use Europe's collective economic leverage to get more from the Chinese in meetings. Do you think that's true? Was an opportunity squandered here by Macron?
I think at least an opportunity to make a case, because there was a moral case to be made, and there was a sort of diplomatic case, and eventually, what we look at that is what France and especially Emmanuel Macron played his own part without sort of much relationship with the other countries. The other thing is that it probably was a good idea to try and see whether he could talk about Ukraine and Russia to China, but he got absolutely nothing. And then he kept on going with the whole sort of scenography of the trip, in which he sort of tweeted himself statements in which he said that they were in complete agreement. And then he had this sort of walkabout in the streets where he spontaneously met spontaneous students who happened just to be around there. And we know that China is a country that stages events very well. And he looked like a dupe half the time. So that's not terribly good.
I mean, John, do you think, I don't know, Ursula von der Leyen was there to make this appear that it was, more about diplomacy, while, France's primary interest with that big delegation of business leaders was really about trade?
I'm not a mind reader, so I'm not certain what Macron's motivation was in inviting her. But certainly the Chinese favoring Macron, disrespecting von Leyen, was designed on their part, again, to emphasize differences. And Macron looked a bit like a patsy. Just as when he went to Moscow just before the Russian big invasion in February of 22, he was played for a patsy, and here as well. But perhaps he was happy with the economic impact on his industries.
But John, help us understand. You've worked as a diplomat for so many years. Could they have possibly gone on this visit not knowing how the other would come off?
Well, that's a tough question, and I accept the premise. But I also, spent a long time in diplomatic service. I've come to appreciate the egos of leaders of countries who think they could somehow miraculously move a country away from its long-held position. So I don't rule out the possibility of some wishful thinking on the part of President Macron.
Okay, Andrew, what's your take on that? How much is an ego at play here? Potentially.
Well, I don't think it's just about trade, as you said. At this time, the war on Ukraine has been going on for some 13 or 14 months. I think that trade, important though it is, it's not the be-all and end-all. I think that Macron wants to highlight himself as the leader of the European Union and trying to broker possibly a peace deal on Ukraine. And obviously, he's not on all fours with some of the concerns of other European nations. But nevertheless, as far as France is concerned, he wants to strike a balance. And it is instructive. During his interview on his plane back to Western media, in European media and American media, he did make the point that Europe should carve out an independent path rather than beholden to everything American. Lest that France would become a client state of the United States. And then he make it quite clear. And now you may disagree with him, but he represents France as a nation, as an independent country, also as a member of the European Union. So I think that that's very important. And China has been very consistent. You said that China has been adamant with this or that, but China has been very consistent in the sense that A, it's not supporting the war. It doesn't agree that war is the solution, but on the other hand, China respects the security concerns of Russia vis-a-vis the NATO expansion. So I think that probably France is trying to strike a balance between the two sides.
John, you interjected with something there earlier on I couldn't quite understand. If you want to clarify, go ahead.
I simply said the war's been going on for 9 years, not 14 months. And I think the failure to understand that is a big problem, apparently in the East as well as in Europe. Moscow has been conducting aggression against Ukraine for 9 years when it seized Crimea 9 years ago. And while China says it's for territorial integrity, it has not voted against Russian aggression in Ukraine, whether in seizing Crimea 9 years ago or the big invasion it launched 14 months ago. And without China's economic support, Russia would be in far more difficult circumstance as it conducts this war of aggression. So to say that China is neutral in this war is the propaganda line of the Chinese party, not a fact.
Anne-Elisabeth, you agree there?
I entirely agree with this. And our president is persuaded that he can wing it in foreign policy, and unfortunately, I think he's wrong. And it was very obvious during this visit, because the whole visit was staged in a way where he played the scenario that the Chinese had for him. But even then, during what is called laughingly a press conference in Beijing, since there were no questions by journalists at all, he and she were speaking one after the other, and Macron managed to sort of, expatiate at great length, making it up, ad-libbing, for twice as long as she, who was looking at his watch because he was so annoyed, and which was incredibly impolite in Chinese form. So unfortunately, many of us in France have come to the conclusion that our president, in that respect, is completely an amateur. He was, and you could see it when he went and visited Vladimir Putin twice, and he's doing exactly the same thing in China now.
Okay. I'm going to move on to another issue here, because there was the analysis going into this meeting that this might be one of the steps that both France and the EU felt could help pave the way for a Chinese meeting with Volodymyr Zelensky. Did you see that as part of the objective here?
Well, don't forget that Zelensky did request President Xi to come to Ukraine to visit him. Now, I think from China's perspective, it's very clear who is the demandeur. I think that from President Xi going all the way to Ukraine, I think it would be possible for Zelensky to have a perhaps Zoom meeting with President Xi himself. Because I think the presidency wants to talk to Zelensky, but not on Zelensky's terms. And obviously, the kind of rhetoric on behalf of the United States, on behalf of Zelensky, on behalf of certain European countries is just one side. They want Russia to surrender everything. Well, as this dragging on war clearly demonstrates, that's not possible. If you look at the map, Russia is a very, very big country, full of resources, and also one of the world's largest producers of agricultural products. I mean, the idea to weaken Russia, perhaps, but to break up Russia eventually on the war, I think that this is a fairy tale. And I think that Russia has shown that it has got persistence. And as far as China is concerned, the idea is to calm down both sides and to broker at least a ceasefire and for both sides to come to the negotiating table for the sustainable peace.
Anne-Elisabeth, I almost got the feeling that sounded a bit absurd to you. How come?
It sounded to me terrifying because there's a very easy way for Russia to stop this war, and they just, it's just withdrawing from every inch of Ukrainian territory. You have one side that has attacked the other. Ukraine never attacked Russia. Russia consistently attacked Ukraine. It seems that you have two different things. And stating the opposite. If you say, well, let's stop now and let's talk now, that essentially means Russia grabbed enough land in Ukraine, and this is a fait accompli.
Okay.
That is not justice.
John, if you had a comment, go ahead. If not, I wanted to move on to another angle. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. I don't have anything else to say.
Okay. I wanted to ask you, Russia, I guess, aside here, how far do you think the U.S., the EU, and France, if it's working in its own kind of independent capacity, how far can they actually diverge on policy toward China? France in particular seems to want to be a lot less isolationist than the U.S. would prefer. Is that just good business, or is there a real issue here with what should be very strong allies seeing how to treat what one considers an enemy in particular in very different ways?
I consider U.S.-EU cooperation right now, especially regarding Moscow's war on Ukraine, to be as strong as it's ever been. And I think France taking a position a little bit outside of that is a typical French position. You might say the French idea of nuance, actually I shouldn't say the French overall, but French leadership idea of nuance is to see what the U.S. is doing and position itself somewhat close, but not too close, and then criticize the U.S. This has been going on for a long time, including vis-a-vis the war in Ukraine since Moscow began it 9 years ago. But again, France is actually playing a pretty strong role helping Ukraine right now, and then Macron deserves credit for that, so I don't want to be too critical of him. But again, I think the West is much stronger today in unity against Kremlin aggression and against growing Chinese aggressive behavior in the Pacific.
And Andrew Leung, let me ask you, France's stance, particularly on Taiwan, I'm assuming it's a bit appreciated then by China because it really resembles China's stance, on Ukraine, i.e. we are not going to take sides.
Well, that's appear to be President Macron's position because Taiwan is a very, very far away island from Europe. And there are lots of problems that Europe have got to contend with. And after all, Taiwan is China, recognized by the United Nations long time ago, since the President Nixon's visit to Chairman Mao. So I think that France thinks that this is the right path to go while maintaining strong ties with China. Now, as far as the Taiwan is concerned, I think that the Beijing feels that there is a ploy used by the United States to provoke China into taking untimely action on Taiwan. With all this naval assets exercises and supplying Taiwan with arms, and also a meeting with the Taiwan leader as if Taiwan was a separate country, paying lip service to the one China policy. And the idea is that if the United States can create a Ukraine scenario over Taiwan, this would drag China down as well. I think that Beijing is too wise to fall for this ploy. Okay,
let me get to Anne-Elisabeth Moutet. Just a little over a minute. Anne-Elisabeth, I saw you had some comments. Go ahead with your final thoughts here.
Actually, Taiwan is pretty close to French territory. We're talking about New Caledonia here, which is a French territory, sending 2 MPs to the Paris National Assembly. And there has been reinforced economic presence in New Caledonia. France is a maritime power in the Indo-Pacific. And one of the messages also carried very discreetly by President Macron was that there's a limit to how much Chinese influence there can be in New Caledonia. We have allies in the area. We are allies with Japan, with the Philippines, with South Korea, with India. And it was also reaffirming that France is not going to give up on being an Indo-Pacific power.
Okay, Anne-Elisabeth Moutet, that will have to be the final word. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists sincerely so much for joining us in this fascinating edition of The Newsmakers, and our viewers, of course, for being with us as well. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.